At times, we view Western thinking as the paragon of intellect. There isn't anything necessarily wrong with that. Most people groups believe their intellectual systems are the best. It's human nature. However, when we start to use these models to judge and question other civilizations, you quickly run into issues. For example, Western thought leaders are not going to find baby Europe in Africa, and looking for one robs you of experiencing authentic African civilization. Today, I'll explain why. What up, African world? It's Home Team here, and welcome back to another video of African history, culture, and worldview. By supporting this channel on Patreon, you're helping in the creation of these videos and contributing to this content. The link to Patreon is in the description box below. To begin, it's critical to understand that this video does not apply to the entire continent of Africa. The information involves the regions of West, Central, and East Africa, so please keep that in mind. So where can we find Africa's great thinkers? Who are the ancient and medieval philosophers? Well, before we can tackle that, we have to face the question of African philosophy itself. There is considerable dialogue within the scholarly world that debates the very existence of African philosophy. I won't go into all of it here, but one example is the question of what's known as ethno-philosophy. Most of the popular material we have on African philosophical thinking is really ethno-philosophy, meaning the general collection of African worldview derived from culture, myth, folklore, folk wisdom, so on and so forth. According to several African scholars, this isn't truly African philosophy for multiple reasons. I thought this debate within the African scholarly world was incredibly salient and needed to be mentioned. However, for the sake of this video, we're going to set aside the general consensus among some African scholars because ethnophilosophy undoubtedly evinces the existence of great African thinkers, and that's what our topic attempts to learn more about. Historically, we've been constantly told that these great African thinkers simply don't exist, especially because European anthropologists did not see reflections of Europe in Africa. Africa, to them, was a dark continent with dark people and a dark history. According to scholar Innocent Onyewunyi, Africans were viewed as savages who developed nothing. Some of Europe's greatest philosophers, David Hume and Immanuel Kant, promoted that thread of thought. Hume and Kant held the view that Africans, in virtue of their blackness, are precluded from the realm of reason and civilization. Via hindsight, this was a puerile assertion. They certainly weren't going to find an African Plato with that mindset, nor were they looking for him. However, in the 20th century, a Belgian missionary flipped this narrative on its head when he began to investigate the mind of the Baluba people of Congo. In many ways, the work of Placide Tempels instantiates the rise of ethnophilosophy. His investigation led him to believe that he had discovered what he called Bantu philosophy. Suddenly, the idea of the unthinking, unreasoning African could not stand. Here's what he had to say. The discovery of Bantu philosophy is the disturbing event for all those who are concerned with African education. We have had the idea that we stood before them like adults before the newly born. In our mission to educate and to civilize, we believed that we started with a tabula rasa, though we also believed that we had to clear the ground of some worthless notions to lay foundations in a bare soil. We were quite sure that we should give short shrift to stupid customs, vain beliefs, as being quite ridiculous and devoid of all sound sense. We thought that we had children, great children, to educate, and that seemed easy enough. Then all at once, we discovered that we were concerned with a sample of humanity, adult, aware of its own brand of wisdom and molded by its own philosophy of life. That is why we feel the soil slipping under our feet, that we are losing track of things, and why we are asking ourselves what to do now to lead our colored people. Placide Tempels wasn't necessarily trying to do complementary work. What he was attempting to do, according to scholar Paulin Hotunji, was to find a psychological and cultural basis for rooting the Christian message in the African's mind without betraying either. But instead of discovering impressionable children, he found sagacious men. His discovery is very nice to hear. However, we have yet to find our Plato. Why didn't Tempels relate to us any Platos? If he was impressed enough to call this Bantu philosophy, surely some names of great ancient African thinkers would have made it into popular culture to some degree. Why haven't their names been passed down in written or even oral form? This line of questioning is perfectly reasonable for Western thinkers. However, as mentioned before, its relevance fails when one considers how some Africans organize their societies. I'll explain. Let's begin with why there were no individual philosophers popularized in these regions. Scholar Oyeka Awomoyela contends that in traditional African society, to attach one's name to an object or an idea is to assert exclusive claim and proprietorship to it, whereas traditional society frowns on the implied possessiveness and ostentatious self-importance. In other words, our African Platos would have been behind the veil of communal tradition. Your knowledge is our knowledge. Thus, promotion of the individual was not a part of many African value systems. For the African, one might argue to the extent that the generalization would permit, truth has an independent existence and is not necessarily dependent for its validity on who voices it. If philosophers argue that their discipline has no absolutes but depends on personalities, they limit its attractiveness to the African mind. So according to scholar Oyeka Awomoyela, individual promotion of an African Plato was simply antithetical to communal ownership, which as a cultural value was ubiquitous throughout the African continent. One might also wonder why many African cultures were oral. Why didn't they write down their thoughts? Even though writing does exist on the continent, many cultures were oral, seemingly valuing preservation through memory over text. There are pros and cons to both models, however. Unfortunately for us Western thinkers, we desire textual documentation. Without the writing, we cannot see an African Plato, and thus, we presume he cannot or does not exist. This kind of thought process, in my opinion, leads us to the same uninformed thinking of David Hume and Immanuel Kant in relation to Africa. So I think we should be careful with that. There seems to be cultural reasons why the African Platos have not made it to our Western ears, and if we're seeking to understand African culture, we should be open to reframing our line of questioning or simply being mindful of our Western biases. Well, I'm all out, guys. I'm hoping you understand a little better why looking for Europe and Africa isn't an effective way to understanding African culture. And if you like these videos and want to help in its continued development, consider supporting the home team on patreon.com. The link is in the description box below. Know thyself. Remember your ancestors. Peace.